So let's take a look at a worked example to help you understand what these different pathways might look like. Those of you who have attended any of IPEN's training or watched the Making Sense of Impact webinar will know that we use this possum control example as a consistent example across all of our resources to make it easy for people to understand. As you might remember, this is all about having an issue with the current possum traps. Now, we can't stop killing possums, so we need to see if the trap can be improved to address welfare concerns. In this adapted example from a real piece of research, we're assuming that we've applied for and successfully received funding from government, as well as some co-funding to develop the new trap. And that reminder that it's always going to need to meet the needs of the end users. So it needs to be affordable, it needs to be usable, so not too heavy, transportable, etc. And just a quick reminder that this is a thought exercise to support teaching and learning, so don't get too worried about some of the details if you disagree with them. So here we are, we have a program logic. It's got the critical issues, noting the concerns about the trap, the fact that possums kill New Zealand's flora and fauna, so we need to effectively control them, and also noting that trapping often occurs in very difficult or inaccessible terrain. So that's a consideration that need to be effectively addressed. To the right-hand side here, you can see what those medium and longer-term outcomes will be. Of course, looking to see ecosystems' health improving. You'll also note things around stronger public support for the use of the traps and things like a decline in the possum populations. And the change we want to see is mapping back to those critical issues. In the middle there's the key activities and outputs. And that reminder that where do we typically hit the skids? That's between the outputs and the outcomes. What we would do in this case is, as we're developing up the program logic, we can use the Impact Pathways framework, the diagram that I'll show you in a moment, just to help tease out our thinking some more, to help us really understand what the appropriate bridging might be. So the first impact pathway we're going to look at is the policy pathway. In this case, policy is about strategic and operational policy. And often, but not always, this is usually led by the public sector. That might be central government or local government. So the question that you'd be asking is, what policy level changes might you need to see happen to support the short term and then the more medium term outcomes happen? There's a few levels that you might think about here. Obviously, we can see that DOC is going to be involved, and there might be changes to their standard operating procedures that need to occur. Is there a need for any legislative change here? I'm not sure, but these are the types of questions that you might ask yourself when you're thinking this particular pathway through. Also noting that we have Predator-Free 2050. Are there connections to policy that this particular work might be connecting to and informing that might help support achieving those medium and longer term outcomes? Examples of the sorts of things that you might be thinking about and then needing to address as you're planning to strengthen this pathway. Now the practice change pathway. This is the most obviously relevant pathway for this example because what we're looking to see is people changing practice, in this case, traps. That's something that we can think about, whose practice we might be wanting to change. That might include the trappers themselves or pest managers, potentially the public if we're looking to engage the public to set traps in their private residence, but also thinking about farmers. Farmers are shown here with a question mark. In theory, yes, farmers is likely to be a group that you would need to work with to achieve your outcomes. But this is going to be a bit dependent on the scope and resourcing and the prioritization that you have in terms of where you're placing your effort for your research, because all research has got some constraints. You can't do all the things. The other thing to note when we're thinking about the public is just recognizing that this is quite closely linked to and has some interdependencies with the community and public pathway and may also have some interdependencies with the policy pathway. So just flagging that these things don't always operate in isolation. Sometimes you might be handing backwards and forwards between the pathways. The public and community pathways, this is all about hearts and minds, and can be a challenging one sometimes, but can be critically important. So in this instance, that might be the local community, but there might also be lobby or interest groups who are both for and potentially against trapping. This might include those groups who are concerned about animal welfare, and also this might be a broader engagement with iwi if that was something that made sense in the context of this particular research project. Now, coming back to this pathway sometimes being a challenging one, but critically important, a great example here was during the COVID pandemic. There was many examples of how important thinking about this pathway was. So if we're thinking about the changes that we needed to see, that might have included things like hand washing, mask wearing, vaccinations, and so on. Doing the research wasn't the answer here. We knew what was needed, but what we needed to do was tailor interventions from, in this case, public health to support that uptake and the application of that body of knowledge, that research about how to effectively counteract COVID through those changes in behaviour. Okay, and commercialisation pathway. This is all about connecting to some kind of commercialisation of a research idea. That might be through an improved product, or it might be a new service or some kind of new process. So when we're thinking about this pathway, then there's a few people we want to be thinking about if the intention is for wide-scale use of traps. It's going to need to consider having manufacturers and distributors for this. So commercialisation is going to be a clear consideration. This might mean thinking about KiwiNet and how you might engage with them, commercial producers or a producer. It could be a manufacturer, but who's not necessarily taking it to market, but as a manufacturer. You might need to get a patent specialist on board. Now, one thing to note is sometimes for some research, thinking about commercialisation might be a bit further down the line, but this doesn't mean that you necessarily just ignore this as a pathway. If you think that there might be some potential in future, what that means is you should instead be thinking about how or what you're doing in the current phase of work is going to help transition or integrate into a next phase that's getting you closer towards commercialisation. To do this, you'll need to think about what that next phase might look like, what the critical issues from a commercialisation perspective might be, and see if you can connect to those in some way. In this instance, maybe it's about the mechanism or the housing for the trap. Maybe all you can do is test some different materials enough to identify a shortlist for manufacture, but then the next step along the process will have to be taken up by another phase of research. But what you're doing already is recognising that commercialisation is going to be a critical pathway, and so you're conducting research in a way that's going to connect up. And finally, Kaupapa Māori. This pathway is a bit of a misnomer because if your research is occurring within this pathway, it's actually about working differently, and the pathway applies across the whole program logic. And what it's going to mean is how you consider and approach all of the pathways may be different because what you're working on, who you're working with, and how you may be working with them might be different because you're working with Māori, or you may have Māori doing the research, leading the research, and you are in support. So although this pathway has been shown for convenience and simplicity on the diagram, sitting in parallel with the other four, really the key point to take away is this pathway actually stretches over the whole diagram, over the whole program logic. Okay, so now let's turn to underpinning pathways. So the knowledge pathway, this is one that many of you will recognise. The purpose of research is about continuing to contribute to the knowledge base as well as contributing to those other impacts. So this is really what this particular underpinning pathway is all about. Without the knowledge base being added to, our research endeavours to address problems or opportunities are not going to advance. So that's why we call this an underpinning pathway. That's often facilitated through things like research publications, but other less formal but no less important types of knowledge might also be built, and we include those in this pathway. So not just research publications, it might include practice notes or other communications, and also covers more general knowledge and awareness of an issue or an opportunity or a solution. Mātauranga Māori is broadly the equivalent of the knowledge pathway, but from a Te Māori perspective. The way that this knowledge is captured and held is not always in a format quite as accessible to the research community, because often it may be held in the forms of tikanga. So it means that it can sometimes be less visible to the system. The other point also to note is that this pathway is just as dynamic and evolving as that traditional or Western knowledge base is. Okay, the capability, relationships, and infrastructure underpinning pathway. So this one is actually 3 in 1, but for the purposes of space, we've squished them all together. The first two, capability and relationships, reflect softer skills or some of those intangible assets. Capability, which talks about skills and ability, that might be people's ability and experience, maybe working with particular stakeholder groups that are important. It might be working with other industry partners. So in this case, it could be experience and skills working with industrial designers. That can involve being able to talk to them in different ways. It might be having skills and ability and knowledge and experience working in that commercialisation space. Relationships might be relationships that you might hold or be able to develop with a potential producer. It might also include having good quality and positive relationships with doc or with commercial pest operator, and also with community. These are all things that actually you need to leverage off in order to conduct your research successfully, and hopefully through the course of a successful research project, you'll be able to build and strengthen these as well. Infrastructure is like these other assets. It's a bit more dynamic in that the research is feeding back into them more directly. So it might include things like databases or similar, so maybe models that underpin AI, but it could also reflect more tangible assets that can be used in future too. It might be prototyping a manufacturing process. Sometimes these things have IP attached to them, but not always. If you think of a publicly accessible app or API, that's some infrastructure of a kind that is developed through the research project, but is also being fed back and available to use more broadly, both to future research, but also out there in the big wide world. That's a quick walkthrough of all of these pathways in the context of the Possum control example. But a couple of things just to bear in mind. Thinking about these impact pathways doesn't mean being all things to all people. What using this as a framework to support your thinking is all about helping to support you think more explicitly about the different pathways that might be relevant to enable your research to contribute to the impacts that you've identified. It can also help test your thinking and the assumptions about which pathway or pathways are the most important or relevant. And we've seen this in some of the workshops we've done as we were developing these frameworks and tools, is that what we have seen is sometimes people are being a little bit aspirational in what they can expect their research to contribute to and achieve. And so using this as a framework helped them get a little bit more realistic about, actually, for this one, maybe it's mainly the policy pathway. We're not really going to be getting to practice change quite yet, or something along those lines. Using this can also help you identify other key partners to help you traverse the gap from outputs to outcomes. And also, this can help you weigh up where to invest effort given the time and resources that you have. So in other words, which pathways are going to be the most important given the needs and objectives which have been expressed through the conversations that you've had with stakeholders or the commissioners of the research. All in all, this is supporting you to take a more strategic approach to how you deliver your research.